Thanks so much. That's quite an introduction, and all it really tells you, because it went on so long, is that I'm a little bit older than most of the people in the room. Had a little bit more experience and opportunity to really learn by being both an entrepreneur and an investor. By the way, I think of myself as an entrepreneur, and people ask me to describe my background and my history. And I think the interesting thing is, having gained my degree here at Tepper back in the GSIA days, I found that I actually had a career and an experience set and a set of skills that I could apply across a wide variety of different types of opportunities. I started my career in corporate America at the largest corporation in the world at the time, AT&T, in their management development program, then on to management consulting, then on to startups. So it's not as though I just sort of suddenly graduated from Carnegie Mellon and became an entrepreneur. But in my head, I was always an entrepreneur. I was always a founder, and I still feel that way today. What I learned, however, along the way is that I had the opportunity, and you do as well, to take those skills and apply them at different points in your life, at different points in your career, to do different things, but you're always going to be the same person inside. I know I am. I think of myself as an entrepreneur, and as I look at where I started, with starting a venture-backed, back in the days before SaaS even really, but a SaaS software company, to then becoming a venture capitalist through first working at another firm and then founding my own. But in parallel with that, I've been, for a very long time, an advocate of diversity in the tech sector. Why? Because there's so little of it. Why? Because I was always the diversity in the room. It was a very unusual thing at that point in time. In that management development program, for example, at AT&T, of 100 people in the room, there were about 12 of us that were women. Here at Carnegie Mellon at the time, it was less than 15% of my graduating class were women. Sometimes that was a phenomenal opportunity to be recognized as a unique person in a room. Other times, frankly, it was kind of lonely. And not as much fun, I think, as some of my male counterparts were having. I have the opposite today. I have more fun than any two people could have. It's true. I'm pretty darn lucky. But what I've learned is that I can be all of those things. I can be a founder, start a venture capital firm. I can be a VC and invest in a whole array of different startups. And I can be, in parallel with all of that, an advocate for the things that I deeply care about. So that's a little bit of what we're going to cover today. I've had a long history. One of my partners actually put this slide together, and I said, stop, we need to take some things off this list. But this just shares with you a little bit about my history with Carnegie Mellon and with Pittsburgh. CMU was my first choice. I got into a variety of different programs. But I had come on campus and had a phenomenal experience here, meeting with and getting to know a little bit the faculty and some of the students. And by comparison to the other campuses that I went to, it was so much more welcoming. I loved the smaller class size, and I had done my undergraduate at the University of Michigan, a giant university, of course. And so Carnegie Mellon, with especially the quantitative aspects of the program, was really appealing to me. That may be and sound even like a little bit of an anomaly, because I was a liberal arts undergrad. And in my class, that class had about 12 women. I think there were probably 3 or 4 of us that were liberal arts undergrads. And all of the others, by the way, weren't women, they were men. The other women in the program had science degrees or math or business or computer science or something else undergrad. Started out doing recruiting on campus. I was a class agent, which back then meant that you got this giant list from Carnegie Mellon and a box of envelopes, and you were the one recruiting all your classmates to contribute to the annual fund, doing all sorts of things from a distance. Was then invited to join the Business Board of Advisors at Tepper. When I reached out, in fact, related to this whole advocacy thing, I had received one of those flyers in the mail that said, what's the percentage of the graduating class? What are their, in diverse backgrounds? What are their salaries? All of the other information. And I was a little dismayed that the numbers were still quite low. And I reached out to the dean at the time, and I said, do you care? Turned out he was a former AT&T guy himself. Some of you will know who that means. And he said, we care a lot. We'd love to have you involved. And that sort of began my involvement with the Business Board of Advisors at Tepper. Lots of other things. One thing I guess I would point out is we have quite a few students, even right now today, that we work with on campus who help us out in a whole variety of different ways. Some of them can't be here. I know they're out of town right now, but maybe the ones that are here, just hold up a hand. Here we have a few of them. That's great. And it's been for us a real two-way street, a win-win from our perspective. We always had a viewpoint that we wanted to have students involved, that some of them might stay in the local community, but whether they did or did not, they were going to have an opportunity to learn a lot more about how venture capital worked, to make connections within the industry, to help us identify investment opportunities here in the Pittsburgh region. We've made one prior investment here in the area. That was a company called SimOp Studios. You might know it. It was founded by Shauna Tellerman. We were her first outside of Pittsburgh investor, and led a financing round to her that later that company was acquired by Autodesk, which is why, by the way, Autodesk now has a facility here in Pittsburgh. Their whole goal in acquiring that company was to build out a development center here and tap into the resources and skills in the Pittsburgh region. So it was definitely a win. A couple of these are students who graduated last year. Lauren and Anna actually helped with the first white paper that we wrote a year and a half ago. And Nilvea and Luisa have been working with us more recently. So it's been really a great opportunity for us. These are the folks on the research side that have worked with us. And Nathan, who some of you might know, who graduated last year, is now founder of his own startup in the Bay Area. So we hope that we're inspiring students from that perspective as well. So what's going on in venture? I thought I'd share a couple of slides for those of you who are either thinking about being investors or entrepreneurs, and make you just sort of tune in on what's happening in the venture market today. Turns out that we have the largest amount of capital ever, if you want to go back in time, going into this sector, but we actually have fewer first rounds of investments, seed rounds of investments. And so people ask, how is that true? We have the lowest amount there since 2010. The perception in the market, of course, is that there are many more startups than ever and many more that are gaining funding. But in reality, what's happening is we have larger rounds going into these companies, and it's going into fewer companies. There are more companies getting started at the, I call it pre-seed level, angel investments, accelerators, incubators. But when it starts to come time to the first institutional round, which is what we do at Illuminate Ventures, that very first institutional round of investment that's now called a Series Seed, there are fewer of those than any time in the last 8 years, which is kind of remarkable. So that's just something to be aware of, and as you think about when you're starting your company. The other thing I think that's important is to understand what's happening before that round of investment. There, as I said, are incubators, there are accelerators, there are angel investors, there are pre-seed rounds, and there are so many rounds of investment before the institutional rounds and what was traditionally the first round, which is called a Series A, that frankly, oftentimes we see startups where a great deal of the capital that's come in has overly diluted the founding team. Their ownership stake has gotten so small that it's a concern to us. Now, you might say, well, you're just investors. Why do you care about what the founders own? We care a lot. I mean, partly I've been one of those founders, and I know kind of what's right and what's not. But partly, we fully understand that that first round of investment, institutional, won't be your last if you're a high-growth company. And if we continue to dilute those founders, that management team and all of the other members of the team, they don't have the incentive. They don't have the will to be there to take lower salaries than they could earn at Google or Facebook or somewhere else, and to put the level of effort in, which is literally that 24/7 practically commitment and passion that these people have to have for their companies. So it's something that we are a little concerned about in the industry, and there are times when we've been known to come in at that point in time and insist that a large pool be created for the employees at the time that we invest to re-up, if you will, the team and make sure that they're at a good point and make sure that where they should be. So just something for anyone who's starting a company to be thinking about. What that means for us is interesting, though. So as investors, I mentioned we do that first institutional seed round. We're on our third fund at Illuminate, and on the first fund, we had an average pre-money valuation that was close to $4 million pre. Those were really early-stage companies. Many of them didn't have any customers yet. Shauna and her company, Wild Pockets, they didn't have customers. They had some prototypes. They had some beta customers, but no revenue. And many of our companies in that initial portfolio fit that same description. Today, what we're seeing is very different. Partly it's due to the public cloud, meaning it's less expensive to start a company than ever before. And we invest only in the software arena. This wouldn't be the same if we were talking about medical devices or consumer internet, where you have to have a vast amount of capital to go out and do marketing and things. But in the enterprise software world, it literally is the least costly time to start a company ever. Partly it's the public cloud. Thank you, Amazon, for stimulating all of that. But partly it's also a couple of other things. One, business buyers now are willing to buy over the internet, buy from people that are doing remote selling, buying literally multi-$100,000 purchases that way without hiring a $250,000 feet on the street, briefcase carrying sales reps. It changes the whole economic structure and selling structure of the companies, right? And there are other factors. We have two companies in our portfolio where the founders, and they're both, one is an Indian entrepreneur, the other is Asian, but both of them began their businesses with IT outsourcing companies where they used all of their profits from that to bootstrap their platform, their software platform companies to initial revenue. One of them that we invested in last year in the Bay Area, interestingly enough, but with their development team all in India, had already gotten to $2 million in recurring revenue with no outside capital. It's rather remarkable. And that's, by the way, a woman founder, CEO of that company. But that is happening all over the U.S. Companies in Pittsburgh, for example, are traditionally, or in Grand Rapids, Michigan, or in Florida, are traditionally much more capital efficient as well than companies that we see in the Bay Area. The result, by the way, is that half of our portfolio is outside of the Bay Area, not there. Okay, so let's maybe move on from overview industry to what's going on around diversity in tech and gender differences and all of that. When I started Illuminate, which was in 2009, I really wasn't sure whether we were going to see many diverse founders. I didn't have that as a pure objective. I certainly wanted to open the door wide and make sure that there weren't any barriers. But we didn't have an investment criteria that said we invest in founders born outside of North America or that were women or anything else. But interestingly enough, I was curious about what we would see. And so we pulled together a huge amount of data. We talked to many of the university researchers that were doing work on this topic at University of Michigan, Scott Page, who's really well known for that, and at Columbia and Harvard and others. And we did some of our own data gathering. That resulted in a white paper that had thousands of downloads that caused us to be invited to speak at the national academies, which I'm told people put on their resumes. I was like, I'm not an academic. I'm not putting that on my resume. But it was an amazing experience nonetheless at many other types of industry events. And I was surprised that people, frankly, were surprised by what we found. Because what the data showed was that women were equally ready to be entrepreneurs, that they actually were typically more capital efficient, and that their companies failed less frequently than their male counterparts. People were surprised by that. And yet the dollars that were going into them and the number of them was minuscule, almost unmeasurable, shockingly. And that was less than 10 years ago. But I found the data that said that was all going to change, and we were at a tipping point, and we were going to see this massive influx of more diversity in tech. And then 8 years later, I sat back and realized it hadn't happened, really hadn't happened. And I didn't understand it. So that's when I enlisted the help of 2 of the interns that we had from here at Tepper, created a survey, went out and gathered data. Once again, this time we surveyed 1,200 people. We went out to both VCs and entrepreneurs, all of them in North America, all of them focused in software. And turns out, by the way, if you don't know, there are only about 1,500 VCs in the country. And we were sampling over a third of those. So we had a really representative population that we were targeting to get this feedback from. We split it between male and female investors and male and female entrepreneurs. And remarkably, we were able to get a third of our target audience being female, which is pretty tough to find. We had some help from some incubators and accelerators that support women in tech, and I had the massive list of every woman VC that's out there. So we went through that process, and what I'm going to share with you are some of the findings from that. We measured really 2 primary things. We measured, for the entrepreneurs, we asked them 3 questions. We asked them about their motivation to be an entrepreneur. Why would you do this? We then asked them, what do you think are the characteristics that are most important to entrepreneurial success? And then we asked them a third question, which it was, what do you think are the hardest barriers? What are the strongest, most insurmountable barriers that you face as an entrepreneur? And we split all of that data between men and women. We asked the VCs all of the same, well, no, we didn't ask the motivation question of the VCs, but we asked them about the success attributes and the barriers. But we then played a little trick, and we asked those VCs, who do you think is more likely to display those success attributes? And who do you think is more likely to face those barriers? And the interesting thing is what we found in some of the results. So it wasn't shocking to me that male and female founders had very similar motivations to be entrepreneurs. For how many of you in this audience want to be an entrepreneur at some point in your career? Okay, like more than half of you. Awesome. And how many of you think that there's likely any difference if you're a male or a female in being an entrepreneur? Is it harder? Less hard? Harder? Okay, probably right. We'll show you some data about why. But by the way, I don't think it's only male and female. I think it's if you're Asian, if you're black, if you're anything other than what's expected. And I think it has very little to do with any kind of intentional bias, because I don't believe most of the world is intentionally biased against one group or another today. But I do think there are some unintentional things that happen that might be helpful for you as entrepreneurs in the room, because I noticed that a very small portion of you are white males. But even if you're a white male, I think we have something to share with you in this conversation. But if you're anything else, we for sure have something to share with you in this conversation and sharing this, because it's important for you to understand how you're perceived and what you might face when you go out and have those conversations, right? So this is a really interesting one to me. It's not a huge portion, but close to 10% of the women entrepreneurs said one of their top 3 reasons to become an entrepreneur was to prove to themselves that they could do it. Not a single male chose that response, not one, out of hundreds, right? Super interesting. But similarity, a lot of similarity. The other one that had a pretty significant difference here is financial gain, where 15% of the male founders said, that's in my top 3. That's one of my top priorities for doing this. And you can see the number for women, 2%, much, much lower. So these are things just to know about yourself and think as you're going through this. But a lot of similarity, and especially in the top motivation, because we really asked the group to pick your top one and then stack rank the others, but pick your top one, and that was really important to see. We then asked them about attributes of success, and this again, I'm going to go through all the founder perceptions before we talk about the VCs view. And what you'll see is that in terms of the absolute top 2 attributes, the men and women think about it very similarly. They thought that perseverance and resilience and being a visionary with a passion for your business were two of the most important things as an entrepreneur. Personally, I would agree. Especially with the resilience and perseverance piece of it, because if you know anything about entrepreneurship, and I have lived it, it is never a trajectory that is up and to the right. There are always peaks and valleys, and as a founder in particular, your role is smoothing out those peaks and valleys for the other people surrounding you. They don't have to know that you're struggling to make payroll next week. They don't have to know that that large account you were counting on just delayed, the sale by 6 months. They don't have to know all of that in the moment that you're digesting it. I'm not saying you should hide things from people, but there are ways to share them that might not have quite as much impact as it does on you personally. But I think there's also some interesting nuances of what the difference is here. Twice as many women as men feel that the importance of having access to networks to be able to raise capital is super important to them. Do the guys think they already have it? Is that why it's less important? I'm not sure. By the way, we don't have all the answers as to why people said this. If there are any people in the audience that are working on a PhD, I would encourage some of you to do the research to figure some of this out, because we don't know those answers. We don't have PhDs. We don't do that kind of research. But we also think, it was also pretty interesting to notice that men have a somewhat better awareness of the importance of domain knowledge here. You can see a quarter of them ranking that quite highly. And very few of the women did, just 14%. But when we see the data about how VCs think about it, you're going to understand that if you've got that domain knowledge, it's a big strategic advantage, and you need to be highlighting it when you go in and talk to investors. Because from their perspective, it's not number 3 or 4 or 8 on the list. It's very high on the list, and something to be aware of. Any questions so far about this? Because I don't want to just wait till the end for questions. Go ahead. Yeah, so this is really interesting. And I don't know the answer to this one either, but the question that we asked them was, how important is it to have, a singular focus in terms of what you're doing, not be diffuse, and be very clear on it, and be able to share that with your team and your customers and your investors and everyone else. And again, we were asking them to stack rank these attributes. And for women, it ranked much lower than the men. Much lower. Now, I will tell you, from a venture perspective, from an investor perspective, when we get a little further on, there's a different viewpoint on that. But again, my goal is to help people understand the difference between how you may be thinking and how an investor may be thinking, so that you can use it to your advantage when you go out to raise capital. It's that simple. Okay, so then the next question here was to ask the VCs. So, okay, how do you view these attributes of success? How do you stack rank them? And you can see, like the entrepreneurs, they thought resilience was super high on the list. Men and women, VCs both. And then you see this sort of little difference in ranking here between domain knowledge, which is on both lists, also super high on the list, but then visionary with passion and ability to attract a great team. Well, ability to attract a great team wasn't high on the entrepreneur list, but turns out VCs care a lot about not just who the founders are and how good you are, but can you attract the right people around you? Because if you think about where a venture-backed company is going, it's going to grow, and it's going to grow fast. And part of what's critical is your ability to bring in the right kind of people, the right talent, keep them, and so an investor is going to be looking at that more strongly. So then we asked this other part of the question, which was, do you think men or women are more likely to display these success attributes, right? And you'll see what happened here. There were 10 attributes. On 4 of them, the VCs basically said they're equal. We're going to see that attribute in men and women on an equal level. But in the remaining 6, actually the remaining 5, it turned out that the men were much more likely to be perceived as having those attributes, and only 1 of them was it perceived that women were more likely to have that attribute than a man. And what attribute was that? Being smart risk takers, which turns out to be one of the lowest ranked success attributes by the VCs. So great, they got one. The guys got 5 others. And the one that they got is not so highly ranked. Okay? But it turns out that 4 out of those 10 were in, 3 of the 4 were in the top most critical attributes that the VCs were considering. So it's not all bad news. I don't want to paint this as like, oh my God, if you're a woman, it's impossible, it can't be done. But again, it's really important to be aware of. We did not have the ability, both because of the data sets we would have needed and the time frame that we had, to split this data out to be able to do it not just by gender, but by ethnicity or by a variety of different other things that we could have used, nationality, et cetera. But I have no doubt that the same things we're finding here that apply to different genders apply to others as well. If you are not perceived as something that people have a history of success with, they don't exactly know how to assign these attributes to you in the back of their heads. Please.
So, I may be asking the obvious, but 0 out of 10 ranked more likely for female founders by male VCs.
Yes.
That's the bias that you're talking about, is my understanding. I mean,
But only 1 was by women VCs, okay? So the women aren't very much different than the men.
different as well. Now, women VCs, first of all, there's 10 men to every.
It's right now about 7% of partners in venture capital are women.
Right, so it's even lower than 10%.
Right.
So it's half of a woman. So I guess the thing is, and I've read
It's 2/3 of one of us.
But I've read the report, and I guess the thing is the conclusion from this bias, I mean, it's not so unconscious bias.
Oh, it's totally unconscious. It is. It has very...
It's very conscious to me. Like, they don't even rank any of those attributes to women. That's not unconscious.
Unconscious bias is something that impacts you that you don't realize is impacting you, that's unintentional. That doesn't mean it's not real bias. Of course it's real. But that is very different from intentional bias, where people are pre-formulated in their heads. If I asked I know all of these VCs, by the way. I know all of them personally. And if I asked any one of them, do you have a preference for male versus female entrepreneurs? They would say, absolutely not. I just completely am all about the deal. I'm all about finding the best opportunity, the best team, and the right market that fits our investment criteria. And they mean it. They're sincere. They're not lying to me. So I, therefore, say this is entirely unintentional, that women and men don't even realize exactly what's going on in their head. Because here's what comes out. They would never say these things to even their peer group in their venture capital meeting after they meet with these founders. You would never find them saying, oh, well, it's a great deal, but she's likely to face much bigger barriers than the man. What would happen is in the back of their head, as they're sitting there in their firm meeting, trying to make a decision about 3 different really great opportunities they have for investment, they might be biasing their decision about investing in one versus another. They might be deciding on a pre-money valuation that's lower on one versus another. They might be thinking that they really have to put more of a strong support organization around one than another, and that influences their thinking about making an investment. It can impact the actual decision to invest. It can affect the valuation of a company. It can affect the size of the check they might be willing to write. All of those things without consciously doing it. And that's why we chose to share the data. It's like anything else. Change begins after awareness starts. And so, we also thought it was important for entrepreneurs to understand how VCs are thinking so they can fight back, can provide data to these entrepreneurs that refutes what they might be thinking in their back of their head before the topic even comes up, because the topic may never come up. Okay, it's a good question. So then we moved on to the barriers to success, and we asked the founders the same same approach of help us stack rank those success barriers that you think are, from insurmountable hurdle down to this really doesn't affect me. And we did this across, I think it was 16 different attributes of success. And by the way, on all of these, we allowed the entrepreneurs to add others. If you want to add a success attribute, let us know what it is. If you want to add a barrier, let us know what it is. Very few were added. We had a pretty comprehensive list. And again, at the very top of the list, men and women entrepreneurs thought very similarly. And for them, it was interesting to me that it centered primarily around financial aspects. How do I go be an entrepreneur when I don't have any financial security? I'm coming right out of school. I may have debt. I may have a family, all sorts of other trade-offs that people have to face. And the second was, how can I be assured of having access to the sources of capital I need in order to build this business? Those were, for their perspective, some of the highest barriers. But I thought it was fascinating that in our research, men actually responded at twice the level of women. It still wasn't one of the top criteria or barriers for either of them, that they thought that balancing work and family was a super hard and difficult barrier for them to face. And then when I first presented this to our own advisory council, which has about half women in the audience, I literally had one woman who's been a founder CEO herself challenge me and say, Cindy, is that data real? And she was serious. She couldn't believe it. And I said, we were a little surprised as well. And so we actually went out and did some phone surveys with a number of the men. And what we learned was that, and some of the women as well, what we learned was that the women, before they chose to become entrepreneurs, had so thought it through, had completely planned for it, had the nanny lined up, had the mother-in-law lined up, had whatever they needed all arranged and lined up. And the men went into it without that. Of course, they asked the family, are you supporting, are you okay with this? And found that they suddenly didn't have the time to spend with their family, their children were growing up without them. There was a lot of stress in the marriage or whatever it might be, and it was hard. It was harder than they expected it to be because of how consuming the role was. And they hadn't thought that they had to perhaps plan for all of that. I don't know does that resonate with anyone in the audience, that maybe that would be what happened to you? Yeah, the women who are planning to be entrepreneurs, how much planning do you think you have to do? What's that?
Oh, you asked how much planning you have to do. I said plenty.
Plenty, yeah. Yeah, interesting. I'm not surprised. Yeah, and this one concerned me a lot. I mean, I've been one of those women founder CEOs that 2/3 of them basically were saying we're disadvantaged. We're going into it with a tougher road to hoe. By the way, all of these entrepreneurs we surveyed are current entrepreneurs with venture backing. We didn't go out to sort of entrepreneur wannabes. We didn't go out to students. We didn't go out to others. These were people actually in operating roles inside that were founders inside of venture-backed enterprise software companies.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you followed up on that regarding which aspect do they think they're disadvantaged? So, for example, do they think they don't have access to capital as much as the new founders do, or are there other aspects to it?
Yeah, so I mean, I could give you more details, and the report does have some more detail that you can go in and find. But it turns out that they do think they are disadvantaged in terms of networks with access to capital and to building teams. Yeah, they weren't saying, that the entire world is against them or anything like that. They were quite specific about some of the concerns. So then, how did the VCs think about those same set of barriers, and how did they attribute them? So starting out with just at a high level, how did male and female VCs think? Interestingly enough, the female VCs ranked that access to capital as a likely much higher barrier for entrepreneurs, twice as frequent a response as the male VCs. Very similar response around how important and hard is it to have a great idea. That's basically perceived as being an insurmountable barrier for anybody. If you don't have it, you just don't have it. And then access to networks to build teams, again, relatively similar, but these were the top three that they considered to be the most important that entrepreneurs would face. Interestingly, not a single VC, male or female, gave a rank to balancing family and work or gaining support of your family in the top 3. And those two were in the top 3 for entrepreneurs. So complete disconnect, if you will, between how VCs are thinking entrepreneurs are facing obstacles versus what the entrepreneurs themselves think. Really, really interesting. So when you go in to do your pitch, maybe you're not going to be wanting to talk about topics that they don't really obviously care about. Or maybe you want to find a VC who actually does get it and cares. Up to you. So then the second part of that question to the VCs was, well, okay, so what's your perception of male versus female founders' likelihood of facing these barriers? And again, ask this blind. They've never met any of the people in our survey. We just, top of your head, you give us the answer. How likely is it for them to face these barriers? And what you can see is they ranked men and women equal on 2 of the 16 barriers. 14 of them, they felt that female founders would face a stronger and higher barrier. And the equal barriers were on having a great, unique idea and being in a non-coastal location. Okay? Well, that's probably pretty straightforward, that if you're in a geography where there are fewer investors, or if you don't have a great idea, that can happen to anybody. So then we actually wanted to translate that into, so what happens in terms of investing? And you can see what the results are here. We asked all of these VCs to tell us how many male and female founders they see a year and how many did they invest in over a 3-year period. And what you'll notice is, in the end, when you do the math, which I won't do here on this slide, but you find that women, VCs, are twice as likely to invest in a woman entrepreneur as a male. But before you read too much into that, they're also twice as likely to see a woman entrepreneur as a male. So the volume of women they see is 2x of the men, and they actually invest in them at the same ratio that the men do. Okay? So what does that say? It says that people like me who go out of their way in our firm to open the door wider and be more inclusive are going to end up with a portfolio that has, as compared to the industry norm, a disproportionate share of more diverse teams. And I'll share a slide later with you that shows that. Other questions? Anybody? Not yet? Okay. Okay, so the last slide on this whole topic is really just to say, so what can you do? So if you're someone with a diverse background or someone who's not, how would you interpret this data and do something useful with it other than say, oh, that's really nice that Illuminate, shared this sort of semi-bad news with us? You can showcase the things that VCs in the back of their heads are thinking are the most important. Your history of resilience, showing the bigness of the full magnitude of your vision rather than going in with a very small story. Demonstrating and talking about the depth of either your domain knowledge or other members of your team. It could be your advisory board that you bring in with deep domain knowledge. It doesn't have to be you, right? And so if you don't have it, it's something to think about, how do I get it? How do I bring that in to my team? Because VCs think it's super important, okay? And then illustrate your ability to do these things they care about. Generating unique ideas. It doesn't have to be about just the investment opportunity that you're taking to them today. You can talk about what you've done historically, even in your educational career, because that's a career too. And each of you has done some, I'm sure, very unique things as part of that. And maybe don't talk so much about some of these other topics that they're not going to give you much credit for anyway, I guess is what I would say. Please.
Can you dig a little deeper into history of resilience? Do you mean having founded and exited or having founded several startups?
No, that's a great question. A history of resilience really is talking about what adversity have you faced in your lives that you have dealt with in a really professional way. What adversity have you faced in, it could be your education, it could be in getting your first job, it could be in a family issue, it could be in almost anything where you've had the opportunity to demonstrate that you know how to deal with tough times. And that's really what we're talking about. How do you deal with a difficult situation professionally and come out the other end in a positive way? And being able to show that you've done that. Honestly, investors are less likely to invest in someone who's never faced those kinds of issues in their lives. It's okay, frankly, to talk about failure. It's absolutely okay. In fact, in Silicon Valley, failure is celebrated. It's kind of a badge of honor that you get to wear as long as you can talk about what you learned from it and how you dealt with it professionally. So that's what we're talking about in terms of resilience. So before I move on, just to give you another chance here on this whole set of research, are there any other questions people have? How it affects you? Please, in the back. Sorry.
When you were asking your questions, for example, one on focused on what we thought it was and then ranked it really low, then did it very high. Did you ask the responder how they would rank themselves on a scale of 1 to 10 about how good they are on focus? So the women might have put it low just because it wasn't an issue.
We did not. What we asked them was to rank these in terms of how important do you think it is as an attribute of your entrepreneurial success. How important is it? Okay, and or entrepreneurial success in general. And the women ranked it much lower, that one attribute, than men. So we could only get a certain attention span, so we didn't go into a lot of additional depth on the questions. Be an interesting question to have the answer to, though. Other questions? Anyone? No? Okay. Yes, go ahead, Alicia.
That's still really surprising to me that VCs don't really care about balancing family and work. Where do you see that moving towards? Or is it getting more polarized as in the VCs don't care, the entrepreneurs are exceedingly caring about it? Or how's that mismatch going from now?
Yeah, so the question is an interesting one. I don't think it's super likely to change quickly. Let's just say that. I think an investor is, of course, aware of how consuming the role of an entrepreneur is, but they believe that the entrepreneur is aware of that and has made that conscious choice before they ever come to see them. So they're not there to help the entrepreneur figure it out. And perhaps I'm talking about venture investors. You might find it to be a little bit different with angel investors earlier in the process. But by the time you're going to raise that million or multi-million-dollar financing round, the assumption is you've figured it out, you know how to handle it. I do think, however, while men probably don't need to raise this topic at all, it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing for a woman to be able to say something proactively in a conversation with a VC, not necessarily in your very first meeting, but to help them understand, this is a conscious decision I've made. My family buys into it. I've lined up all of the support network I need, because their perception, as we saw in terms of that being a barrier, is going to be higher for women than men. But honestly, I don't believe that VCs, it's just not even in their consciousness, as we saw on the prior chart. So if they're not conscious of it, it's not likely to change rapidly. Okay. So I thought I'd share a little bit about Illuminate, who we are. This is our team. Jennifer, turns out she and I have known each other for more than 20 years. She was the head of products in the company I founded, went on to head products at DocuSign, at Smartsheet, 2 IPOs, and then most recently FlowRoot. And so has an incredible operating background. She didn't get her MBA here. She got it at UCLA, did her undergrad in engineering in Oregon as well. And then Rebecca, so Rebecca was GM at Microsoft, 20 years at Microsoft, a really incredible, she was Ray Ozzy's technical strategist there. At the time, he was the chief architect of Microsoft. So brilliant engineer by background. She's actually a venture partner with us, which is a part-time role, and now running all of software engineering for Hewlett-Packard. So it's a pretty incredible team. Yes, there are all women there. I know that's rather shocking. So these are just to give you some visibility into the areas that we invest in and the kinds of growth rates that we see there. They're growing, some of them, like enterprise blockchain, at an astronomical rate, but starting from very small numbers relative to where some of the others are. They're all multi-billion-dollar categories. You won't find investors investing in small things, niche things, that they don't expect to grow into those multi-billion-dollar kinds of categories. So no big surprise there. And then I guess, why is it that we have all of these student interns? Why do we have the students in residence, the research assistants, and all of that? We're a micro VC firm. I didn't talk much about that at the beginning, but that means we're a very small fund, sub-$100 million size funds, investing as seed investors, first institutional round into these companies. So we actually have to have a reach much broader than that very small team that you just saw. And we do that through these other kinds of resources. Our Business Advisory Council includes the CEO of Nextdoor, the COO of Square, the head of corporate strategy of IBM, the co-head of the Windows division of Microsoft, the CFO of Yahoo, and on, 40 people, because every one of them can help us with finding good investment opportunities, conducting due diligence. Some of them even sit on boards for us, and it's a way that we create bigger platform than 4 people possibly could. And that intern group turns out to be like a secret weapon for us. We have more than 30 graduates, if you will, from that program today. And in fact, one of the most recent investments that we made was sourced to us by one of those interns who joined Deutsche Telekom Ventures, had done a whole bunch of sector assessment work for us as an intern when he was doing his MBA at the Haas School at Cal, and reached out to us and said, this company I just saw yesterday is much too early for us. We do growth stage investing, but I think they might be a perfect fit for Illuminate. And turns out they were. So we've had people in this group hire other people from our internship program. We've had people in this group fund other people, and we've had 2 of these folks who have graduated, if you will, into launching their own companies, like Nathan, who founded Find, and Shauna, who went on and founded Modzy, her second company that she's been the co-founder and CEO of. So it's a pretty cool group. I told you I would mention and share what diversity looks like within our portfolio. The numbers on the left are across the 23 companies that we've invested in, and on the right are the industry average. We are way over the top in terms of disproportionately diverse in terms of our founding teams, and we're really proud of it. We've had multiple Latino founder CEOs. We have almost 40% of our portfolio company have at least one woman co-founder, including my favorite, which is a company up in Vancouver founded by identical twin sisters. Yeah, it's like a needle in a haystack. We love it. And they're doing incredibly well. And we don't ever use diversity, gender, anything like that as our investment criteria. We start with a very different pool, and we invest in the best companies there. We have great performance across our portfolio. We've had companies go public. We've had companies acquired by New Relic, Cloudera, Autodesk, Hearst Corporation, and others. And these are all companies that we're really proud of. And that's pretty much it. If you want to see the white paper, you can go to our little hidden page and download it. It's illuminate.com/whitepaper. And both of the papers are there, the old one and the newer one. And I just open up to any questions you might have. Are we good on time? Yeah? Okay. Thoughts, questions? Illuminate? Deal flow? We take all of that? Yes, please.
I'll just ask a really general question first. Really enjoyed the presentation. But do you all have any direction for future research or data in the pipeline?
It's a good question. So 2 of your classmates in the Tepper School have been working with me this year on extending that same survey out to students. We don't have all the data back from that yet. We have gotten the data back from the Tepper students, but we have about 6 or 7 other university campuses that we're pulling, that we're conducting that survey with. So the answer is yes. I did tell them that this time I'm not writing the white paper. Someone else is going to have to do that because it takes a lot of effort to pull together what you'll find there. But we realize that we have certainly gotten a set of perceptions from current entrepreneurs, but that it was just as important to be asking students how they thought about it, what their sources of data were, how they make a decision, whether to start, whether to become an entrepreneur or not, and some of those kinds of things. So that's what's next. That's probably sometime next year.
Cindy, I'm curious if you see any trends in terms of geographic, diversity. Are you investing out on the coast? I know you guys talked a little bit about the gender relationship to that, but just overall trends in terms of
Yeah.
your looking.
Yeah, so one of the things you'll find, and just stepping to the other side of the equation for a second, is that smaller, newer funds, the partners tend to be much more diverse, okay? And so I do think it's kind of natural. Diversity does attract diversity. And I think it's a good thing because those smaller, newer funds are typically early stage investors like we are. And the way I look at it is if you don't get started, if you don't have that first round of funding, you're never going to see more of them that are the big successful ones either. So I do think they are attracting more diverse entrepreneurs, but I don't think it's geographic in nature, other than the fact that there is a little bit of a nuance to that in that there are more small new funds in non-coastal geographies than there were historically, just because this whole concept of micro VC now exists, and there are now hundreds of those funds that are here or Ann Arbor or Toledo or wherever they might be. But I don't think it's that there are just more diverse entrepreneurs in those geographies. Does that help? Yeah. Other question? Hey, Max. It's a great question. So for those who didn't hear, the question is, are women VCs investing in more women because they seek them or because the women come to them, right? So both. That's the answer. And I think, I'm part of a group called All Raise that is going out of its way to offer female founder office hours, as an example. I've been involved in nonprofits like Astia and Springboard and others that for years now, many years, have supported women's entrepreneurship. But I can tell you, as a founder and CEO myself, when I went out to raise capital, if I had had the option of raising it from a woman VC, I would have been very interested in that. Not for, I guess, partly for the reason that when you raise capital, those are the people that are going to sit on your board. And I would have liked the idea that some of my investors would have a background more similar to me. I didn't have that happen, but what I did do is I went to my board, and we had agreed we would bring on an independent board member, and I told them, and I was to select it, and then the way it normally works is the founder selects, the rest of the board members approve, and I went to them and I said, I just want you to know that the 3 candidates I have are all women. And they were like, great, awesome, let's go, let's do it. And they were super supportive of that. We ended up having the CFO of Barclays as our board member, which was just an incredible win for us. We were selling into CFOs, so it was a very logical kind of a relationship as well. But she was frankly at least as qualified as anyone else on our board to be serving on the board, and it was a win. But I do think it's both. I think it's both. Question, yeah.
So one of your last slides showed how your VC invests in more diverse companies. Right?
Yeah.
Especially compared to other VCs, it seems like a lot more diverse. find that they don't invest in these, you're saying like they don't invest in the diverse companies because they don't have a diverse enough starting pool? Is that just because of a momentum like shift? Like, are you able to start changing the mindset of other VCs once they realize like, oh, you just don't have a good enough starting pool? Like, what are you finding is the reaction when the other VCs see your VC doing this?
Brilliant question. And the reason I say that is, when we started Illuminate, I did ask myself the question, should I start a firm that invests only in women? I went out and did a whole bunch of research and realized that was a singularly bad idea at the time. There weren't enough of them. It would bias our pool. We were investing only in enterprise. And I would have found it very hard to find institutional investors as well. But what I do think is true is that by creating a very successful set of funds and by showcasing those successes, like Chris Cabrera, who's a Latino founder CEO, I sat on that board for 10 years. He took Exactly public. After he took that company public, it was acquired 18 months later by Vista, one of the large private equity groups, for over $500 million. By showcasing deals like that other people missed out on, or Bright Edge, that is founded by two Asian entrepreneurs, that's now running at over $100 million in recurring revenue that we invested in at zero and couldn't find a co-investor to go into with us originally. Found one, but we probably helped them pitch to 30 different funds before we did, because they looked a little different than the norm too. Two men, but Asian men. By showcasing that and by having high performance, I think it's certain that other VC firms will say, how did we miss that deal? How did we miss that other one? And start thinking a little bit more broadly. I know it's happening already. I'm really encouraged that it's happening already. And in fact, women entrepreneurs for many firms today and women investors for many firms today are really sought after by the forward-thinking firms. Yeah. Other questions? No? That's it. Okay. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.